The noon sun baked the dust of the trading post into the color of rust. Vendors shouted over one another, pushing sacks of grain and bolts of fabric. But in the center of it all stood a girl who did not belong to any of those things. Ruth stood barefoot on the wooden platform, wrists bound in front of her, eyes downcast. Her hair clung to her cheeks in damp strands, and her faded dress clung tighter still. Beside her stood her father, Walter Bell, a man whose bitterness had fermented so long it soured everything around him. "She's clean," he barked to a group of onlookers, mostly ranchers and freightmen. "Strong enough for chores, just not useful in the way a wife ought to be." There was a rustle of discomfort in the crowd, but no one spoke up. Ruth didn't flinch. She'd known this day was coming. It had been whispered in slammed doors and broken plates, in the way her mother stopped calling her by name, in the way her first husband had looked at her with such disappointment after 3 winters and no child. "Useless," he'd said, as if that one word explained everything he thought she was. Walter raised his voice again. "I'll take $20. That's less than half the price of a good steer, and she eats less." Laughter, low and uneasy. Ruth looked out beyond the faces and saw only sky. A man stepped forward, and he was tall, silent, wrapped in a coat too warm for the weather. His face was lined but not old. His name, she would learn later, was Elias Hart. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, from his coat pocket, he took out a folded envelope and handed it over. "Don't speak of her again," he said to Walter. "You lost that right." No one stopped Elias as he walked her away. He didn't tug the rope. He didn't push. Just walked beside her until they reached his wagon, where 4 children waited, 2 girls, 2 boys, all eyes and elbows in tangled hair. Ruth sat quietly beside the fire that night as Elias prepared beans and cornbread. The children whispered and peeked at her. Uncertain, she expected instructions and she expected demands. She expected to be put to use. But Elias only nodded toward the cabin door. "You'll sleep inside. There's a cot near the stove." The next morning, she tried to earn her keep. She fetched water, swept the floor, burned the cornbread twice. The youngest child, a boy with a gap-toothed smile, laughed until he fell off the stool. She apologized and stood waiting for Elias's judgment. For a scolding. Maybe worse. Instead, he just said, "Takes time. You'll figure it out." Ruth didn't know what to do with gentleness. She'd never been taught to hold it. Still, she kept trying. She learned how to make the fire catch in damp mornings. She learned how Elias liked his coffee black and quiet. She bandaged a scraped knee, sang to the girls while shelling beans. Her voice was thin, but they listened. One night, a fever came hard and fast. The oldest girl, Nora, shivered and burned in her cot. Elias looked panicked for the first time. Ruth knelt beside the girl, soaked a cloth, whispered songs from her own childhood, and stayed up all night pressing cool water to the girl's forehead. When morning came and the fever broke, Elias looked at her like something had shifted. She wasn't just a body in the house anymore. Weeks passed. Then one day in town, she saw her ex-husband's sister. The woman sneered, looked her up and down. Guess someone finally took pity on the barren one. Ruth opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't need them. Elias stepped in, voice low and steady. "She's the reason my children laugh again. That's worth more than any bloodline." The sister left in silence. That night, Ruth cried for the first time in years. Later, at a harvest festival, a drunken man cornered her behind the barn. His breath was sour, his hand rough. Before she could scream, Elias was there. He struck the man hard enough to send him sprawling, then turned to Ruth and gently checked her wrist where the man had grabbed her. "You're safe," he said. And for the first time, she believed it. A month later, as she stirred stew by the fire, the youngest boy ran in and yelled, "Mama!" He fell from the tree. She froze. "Mama!" The words settled deep in her chest, warm and terrifying. She ran outside, tended the wound and never corrected him. That night, Elias sat beside her. "You've got a choice. Ruth, you can stay or you can go. I won't keep anyone who doesn't want to be kept." She looked at him, then at the sleeping children. "You didn't keep me," she said softly. "You let me belong." From that day on, she did. Elias didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. He wasn't the kind of man to fill the air with stories or charm. He let silence do most of the talking, the kind that came from long winters and the weight of responsibility. When he handed Ruth's father the envelope of bills, he didn't ask for a discount or clarification. He simply said, "She won't be judged anymore," and turned away, leaving the man to sputter behind him like dust from a bad road. No one followed. No one questioned him. Not the vendors, not the ranch hands leaning on their saddles, not even Ruth's own father, who looked more relieved than regretful. The wagon Elias drove was old but sturdy, the kind that creaked with use but held steady on rough trails. The ride was long and quiet. Ruth didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer. The children in the back sat piled among blankets and firewood. The oldest, a boy with a serious brow, stole glances at her. The youngest, a girl with curls too wild to tame, stared openly. Ruth kept her hands folded in her lap, thumbs pressed together to keep from trembling. They arrived just before sunset. The cabin stood among tall pines and sloping hills, its roof patched with fresh shingles and the chimney smoking gently. Elias helped her down from the wagon but didn't touch her arm. "There's soup on the stove," he said. "You're welcome to it." Then he turned to unbuckle the horses. Inside, the warmth hit her first wood heat, not kindness, but it was something. The table was cluttered with school slates and half-knitted socks. A pair of boots leaned near the hearth, too small for Elias, clearly the boys. A shawl lay draped over a rocking chair. None of it looked arranged, but none of it looked unloved either. The children took her in with a mix of curiosity and caution. They didn't speak to her the first night. They watched as she ladled out soup and fumbled to find where the bowls belonged. Elias ate in silence, his eyes not cold but distant, like someone looking over land rather than across a table. When the meal was over, he nodded toward the cot near the wood stove. "You can rest there. Tomorrow's chores start early, but there's no rush on your part." Ruth nodded. Her voice hadn't worked right since the auction, maybe longer. She didn't trust it not to crack. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and sat while the fire popped and settled. In the morning, she rose before the sun. The floorboards were cold and the cabin still. She found a broom in the corner and began to sweep, slowly at first, unsure if she was overstepping. When the youngest girl wandered in, rubbing her eyes, Ruth offered a piece of dried apple. The child took it, studied her, then ran back out. Small things. Quiet beginnings. By the end of the week, she'd learned the pantry layout, how to patch socks with coarse thread, and that the middle boy hated porridge unless there was a spoonful of molasses on top. She discovered the chicken coop was older than it looked, and that the water pump needed 2 hard pulls before it caught. Elias never praised her, but he didn't correct her either. When she burned the cornbread again, he just scraped the bottom and said, "Still feeds." She watched him with the children, how he tied their boots with one hand while holding a hatchet in the other, how he'd listen to the boy read aloud with that steady silence that somehow made a person try harder. He wasn't affectionate in the way some might expect. There were no hugs, no pats on the back. But he remembered things. He brought Ruth a pair of gloves when he saw her knuckles cracked from the cold. He adjusted the cot closer to the fire on a particularly bitter night. One afternoon, as she hung laundry on the line strung between 2 pine trees, she heard laughter from the woods. Real laughter, not the hollow kind people offer out of politeness. The children were chasing each other, shouting, their boots kicking up mud. Elias leaned against a tree, watching. When he turned and saw Ruth, he gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in years. That evening, the children told her stories about the trees that made faces if you stared too long. She listened, asked questions. And when the youngest girl climbed into her lap without asking, Ruth didn't flinch. She simply held her there until the fire burned low. Later, while washing the last of the dishes, Elias stood beside her drying with a rag that had seen better years. "They sleep easier now," he said. "I do too." She glanced at him, unsure what to say. He didn't press for a reply, just finished the last plate, set it on the shelf, and walked outside to check the horses. In that silence, Ruth felt the shape of her life shifting. There were no declarations, no promises carved in stone, but something unspoken had taken root. Dignity, perhaps, or the early sprout of belonging. It didn't matter yet what it would grow into. For now, it was enough to know the soil here was kinder than any place she'd known before. The mornings came early in Elias's cabin, the kind of early that crept through the pine cracks before light ever touched the sky. Ruth woke each day to the sound of firewood shifting in the stove, boots shuffling across the floor, and sometimes the faint sniffle of a child still half lost in sleep. She tried to rise before them, slipping quietly from her cot by the stove, gathering her shawl as if each motion might give her purpose. She didn't know the routine yet. Not really, but she was determined to earn her place. The children were polite in that cautious way of kids who've seen things go wrong before. They watched her from the corners of rooms, peeked through door frames, whispered in tones she pretended not to hear. The oldest boy, Caleb, rarely spoke unless spoken to, barely spoke. Miriam, barely 10, watched her with sharp, guarded eyes. The twins, Samuel and Liza, were all elbows and giggles, but even they approached her like one might a skittish animal. The first time she tried to cook breakfast, she burned the flapjacks and used too much salt in the beans. The skillet stuck, and smoke filled the small room before she could wave it out. Ruth's hands trembled as she scraped the pan, heart tight in her chest. Elias stood in the doorway, watching. She braced herself for a scolding, maybe a sigh, but he only stepped forward and lifted the skillet from her hand. "This pan's older than all of us," he said calmly. "It takes patience." That became the rhythm between them. She tried. Sometimes she failed. But Elias never raised his voice. He'd step in quietly when needed, then step back just as silently, giving her space to learn without shame. That gentleness undid her more than anger ever could. She didn't know what to do with kindness that asked for nothing in return. It was the small things that started to change first. The way Miriam began leaving the water bucket closer to the door in the mornings. The way Samuel offered her half of his cornbread without being prompted. The first time Caleb let her mend a tear in his shirt without pulling away. Liza, boldest of them all, began tugging at Ruth's sleeve when she wanted to show her a drawing or a newly braided doll. Ruth's voice remained fragile, like something unused for too long. It cracked when she tried to sing or call across the yard, so she relied on gestures and gentle touches, a hand on a shoulder. A nod at the right moment, a smile when her throat couldn't manage words. The children seemed to understand. Words had never been the strongest language in that house anyway. One afternoon, Ruth found Elias splitting logs behind the cabin. She brought him a tin cup of water and lingered, watching the motion of his arms, steady and sure. He paused, wiped his brow, and took the cup. "They don't warm up to folks easy," he said, nodding toward the house. "But they're watching. They see how you are." She nodded, unsure how to reply, and turned to go. But he said one more thing before she left. "They don't laugh much. But lately, I hear it again." That evening, while Ruth sat by the fire darning socks, the children surrounded her with stories about the woods, tales of a one-eyed fox and a haunted well near the ridge. They talked over each other, and Ruth let them, letting their voices fill the room like music. She listened, mended, and when her needle pricked her thumb, Miriam handed her a scrap of cloth without being asked. On laundry day, the children helped without protest. Ruth taught them how to rub stubborn stains with ash soap, how to hang garments so the wind didn't carry them into the thickets. They taught her how to whistle through pine needles and where the frogs gathered after rain. It was an uneven exchange, but somehow fair. Some nights, Ruth sat by the window with Liza curled against her side. The girl's breath would slow, warm and rhythmic, and Ruth would stay still until her legs went numb. In those moments, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt needed, not for what she could do, but simply for being there. Elias continued to speak sparingly, but his silences grew softer. He made room for her in the small things, moving a jar to the lower shelf, fixing a creaky board in the floor beside her cot, bringing her a thick blanket before the first frost. Once, after supper, he handed her a carved spoon and said only, "Yours now." She didn't know if he meant it as a gift or a habit, but she held it like something sacred. There was no grand moment when Ruth knew she belonged, no declaration from Elias or the children. It was a slow settling, like snow on a rooftop, quiet but certain, a shift in how they looked at her, how they let her into their quarrels and their laughter, a growing space where she didn't have to prove herself to be allowed to stay. By the time the first hard frost came, Ruth was folding linens with Miriam, pulling splinters from Samuel's palm, humming tunelessly to calm Liza after a nightmare. Caleb handed her a book one night and asked if she'd help him with the long words. When Elias walked in and saw them all gathered around her, he didn't say a word. But later, as he added another log to the fire, he looked at her and gave the slightest smile. Not one of pride or possession, but something deeper. Recognition. She was no longer just surviving in his house. She was becoming part of it. The storm rolled in just after dusk, low clouds thick with snow and the wind sharp enough to rattle the windows. The children had gone quiet that evening, their usual chatter replaced by the hush of weather settling heavy over the roof. Ruth moved around the cabin, lighting the oil lamps one by one, careful not to waste the wick. Elias stood near the door, listening to the wind the way a man does when he knows the land better than words. He didn't say anything, but his jaw was set tight. Outside, the pines bent and groaned. By the time they finished supper, Miriam was already pale. Her cheeks had gone chalky and her eyes looked too wide for her face. She said she felt cold even though the stove was burning high. Ruth placed a hand to her forehead and felt the heat pulsing under the skin. It was the kind of fever that didn't waste time. Within the hour, the girl was bundled in every blanket they owned, shivering and drenched with sweat. Her breathing came in short, uneven gasps, and her fingers twitched even in sleep. Elias paced the cabin once, twice, then stopped in front of Ruth. He didn't need to ask. She was already soaking a cloth in the basin, already tucking a towel under the girl's chin in case she vomited. She sat at Miriam's side, pressing cool rags to her forehead, whispering softly even when it seemed the girl couldn't hear. The other children watched from their cots, wide-eyed, afraid. Ruth turned her head and gave them a small nod, a signal that someone was in control, even if her own heart raced faster than it had in years. Hours passed. The wind howled louder. The oil in the lamp burned low. Ruth stayed by the girl's side, changing cloths, spooning water between cracked lips, wiping sweat from her neck and brow. At one point, Miriam began to tremble so hard the cot shook. Ruth wrapped her arms around the child, held her until the shivering passed, then whispered prayers she barely remembered from her own mother's lips. Her back ached. Her knees throbbed. She did not move. Elias sat across the room, silent, watching. His hands were clenched, not in anger but helplessness. He was a man who could split trees with a single swing, who could fix a roof in a blizzard. But this was something else. This was his daughter, fragile and fevered, and he couldn't fight the sickness with strength. Ruth didn't look at him much, but once, in the deepest hour of the night, their eyes met. He gave a small nod. She nodded back. It was enough. By dawn, the fever broke. Miriam lay still, the sweat gone, her breath even and soft. Her skin was cooler now, no longer burning with danger. Ruth leaned back, her muscles numb, her head light. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, someone had laid a quilt over her shoulders. Elias stood at the stove, making coffee. He glanced over, eyes tired but calm. "She's better," he said. Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice. She stood slowly, legs stiff, and walked to the basin to wash her hands. When she turned back, Elias was pouring her a mug of coffee. He handed it to her without a word. She accepted it like a truce. The children crept toward her one by one. Liza clung to her skirt. Samuel handed her a piece of dried apple. Caleb didn't say anything, but he sat close to her on the bench while she sipped. They didn't know how to thank her, not with words, but she didn't need them to. Their nearness was enough. The girl they feared losing had stayed, and somehow, Ruth had kept her here. That day, Ruth moved through the cabin differently. She still swept the floor and washed the dishes and folded the linens, but her presence held weight now, not like furniture, like a pillar. The children followed her with their eyes. Elias didn't hover as much, didn't double-check the stove or inspect the laundry line. He trusted her hands, her judgment, her place. That evening, when the fire crackled and the wind had died, Elias stood at the doorway again. He looked at Ruth, not just with tired gratitude, but something deeper. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. What he said was this: "I don't think she would have made it without you." Ruth didn't reply right away. She was mending a sock, her fingers moving slowly through the wool. When she did speak, her voice was soft. She's strong. She just needed someone to see her through. He nodded, then turned to go, but paused before the door. "We all do," he said, and then stepped out into the cold. Ruth kept sewing long after he left, the fire warming her knees, the cabin quiet except for the rhythm of the needle pulling through fabric. Outside, snow fell gently, soft and slow, and inside, something had shifted. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't a helper or a placeholder. Elias had seen it now, not just what she could do, but who she was. Necessary. Not in a loud, heroic way, in the way a beam holds up a roof, unseen but essential, and for the first time in a very long time. Ruth felt steady. The sun was high and sharp the day Elias took Ruth into town. It had been weeks since she'd left the land, and the change unsettled her more than she expected. The sound of voices, wagons clattering across dry dirt, shopkeepers calling out their prices, all of it pressed in around her, stirring a nervousness she thought she'd long since buried. She kept close to Elias, walking a half-step behind, her hands tucked beneath her shawl as if she could fold herself into the fabric. They needed flour, lamp oil, and more thread for mending. But Ruth also carried a quiet sense that this day would test her. She didn't say it aloud, not even to herself, but the feeling sat beneath her skin like a splinter. It was the kind of day when ghosts might show their faces. It happened near the general store. Elias was loading sacks of flour into the wagon when Ruth heard her name, not spoken gently but spit from a mouth that once pretended to smile. She turned, and there they stood, her former husband's sister, Clara, and Clara's mother, Abigail, both dressed in pressed calico and wearing expressions that could turn milk sour. Their eyes swept over Ruth like a judgment already made. "Well," Clara said, her voice sweet with poison, "looks like you landed somewhere after all. Who's the poor man this time?" Ruth didn't answer. She stood still, shoulders back, eyes steady. The words stung less than they once would have. Abigail narrowed her gaze and stepped forward, her tone sharper. "It's a pity. Pretty enough girl, but what good's a wife who can't bear a name forward? Always knew it would come to this." Ruth opened her mouth, but the reply tangled in her throat. It wasn't that she lacked the words, it was that she no longer needed them. Still, the ache in her chest returned, familiar as an old wound, and for a flicker of a moment, she was that girl again, standing on a porch with her belongings in a sack, told to leave because she could give no child. Before she could decide what to do, Elias stepped beside her. He had heard enough. His voice was low, the kind that made people listen. "That woman," he said, gesturing to Ruth without taking his eyes off the two women, "keeps my home together. She tends to my children when they scrape their knees and miss their mother. She makes our meals warm, our mornings steadier. She brings more good into that house than I ever could have asked for." He paused, and the silence cut deep. "And none of that has a thing to do with bearing children." The street had gone quiet. Clara shifted uncomfortably. Abigail opened her mouth, then closed it again. No one stepped forward to join their side. Elias turned back to Ruth, offering his hand not as possession or rescue, but as invitation. She didn't take it right away. Instead, she looked at the two women who had once made her feel less than whole and said, softly but clearly, "You don't get to measure me anymore." Then she turned and walked away. Her steps were slow but even, not rushed, not uncertain. Her chin was high. Elias walked beside her in silence, offering nothing more than his presence, which was all she needed. They returned to the wagon without looking back. As they rode out of town, Ruth sat straighter than before. The tension in her shoulders unwound not all at once, but like rope eased from a burden long carried. She didn't speak for some time, letting the rhythm of the wheels and the steady clop of hooves work through the tangle in her thoughts. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't feel broken. What she felt was the slow settling of something strong beneath her ribs. A new root, perhaps, taking hold. She hadn't needed Elias to speak for her, but the fact that he had without hesitation, without calculation, meant more than she could say. Back at the cabin, the children ran to greet them. Samuel tugged at her hand, asking if she'd brought licorice, and Liza showed off a crooked daisy chain she'd made for Ruth's hair. Inside, the fire was already lit, the smell of pine and ash welcoming her home. She set the bundles down, rolled her sleeves, and began unpacking the flour. Later that night, after the children had been tucked in and the house had gone still, Elias sat at the edge of the porch, looking out across the trees. Ruth stepped outside and sat beside him. For a long time, they said nothing. Then, with her voice barely above the hush of wind through the pines, Ruth said, "I never thought I'd get to walk away from that kind of hurt. But today, I didn't run. I walked." Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. He reached over, covered her hand with his, and let the quiet speak for them both. The night was cool, but she didn't feel the cold. For the first time in years, she felt full in herself, not in spite of her past, but because she had outlived it. She had faced it, heard it try to diminish her again, and still she had stood tall. That was enough. That would always be enough. The sun was beginning to sink low over the ridge, casting long golden shadows through the pine trees as Ruth walked alone toward the general store, a basket on her arm and a quiet list in her mind. Elias had stayed behind to mend a gate, and the children were with neighbors, trading eggs for honey. The little town was calm that evening, the kind of hush that came just before twilight, when the day's labor had settled into bone and people stood a little slower, talked a little softer. Ruth liked that hour. It gave her space to breathe. Inside the store, she gathered what they needed: salt, lamp oil, coffee if the price hadn't gone up again. She was counting coins on the counter when she heard the door creak open behind her. The smell hit her before the voice did: stale liquor, sweat, the sour scent of a man who drank to forget and grew mean in the forgetting. "Well now," the man said, slurring the words just enough to make them sluggish. "Aren't you the quiet little thing Elias' heart took in?" Pretty face for someone with nothing else to offer. Ruth didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the counter, her hand closing around the change. The shopkeeper pretended not to hear, focused instead on weighing potatoes for someone in the back. "You think playing house with that widowed tree stump makes you respectable," the man continued, stepping closer. "We all know why he brought you in. Don't think he's the first to pay for something silent and broken." Ruth stepped aside, walking toward the door with her basket. She had learned to keep her shoulders back and her pace steady, to offer silence where once she would have shaken. But the man wasn't done. He reached out and caught her wrist, hard enough to twist. Her breath caught, pain sharp up her arm. And then he was gone, ripped away like a weed pulled by the root. Elias had entered without a word, without warning. His fist met the man's jaw with a crack that echoed through the wooden shelves. The man staggered back, hit the counter, slid down in a heap. For a moment, no one breathed. Elias didn't look around for approval. He stepped to Ruth's side, gently took her arm, and examined her wrist where the skin had already begun to darken. His touch was careful, steady, but his eyes burned. "You all right?" he asked. Voice low. She nodded once, but her throat felt tight. He didn't ask again. Instead, he guided her outside, holding the door open and shielding her from the stairs. On the boardwalk, under the fading light, he took her basket and sat her down on the edge of the wagon. "Let me see it," he said, and she offered her wrist again, this time without hesitation. He ran his thumb gently over the bruise, his other hand cradling hers. "Nothing broken," he murmured, "but it'll hurt come morning." "I've had worse," she whispered, and he looked up, eyes meeting hers with something fierce and tender all at once. "Doesn't mean you should have," he said. They rode home in silence, but it was not the kind that weighed heavy. It was something else now, an understanding, built not from words but from what had been proven. Elias hadn't hesitated. He hadn't calculated or waited. The moment she was in danger, he moved like instinct. At the cabin, the children weren't back yet. Ruth sat near the fire while Elias found a strip of cloth and a tin of salve. He knelt beside her, dabbing gently at the bruise, wrapping the wrist with the kind of care usually reserved for something fragile and beloved. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner," he said. "You were there exactly when I needed you," she replied. His hands paused, holding hers. She could feel the strength in them, but also the restraint. He wasn't a man who asked for more than was given, but in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a shift, like the last piece of a puzzle falling into place. When the fire settled low and the shadows stretched long across the floor, Ruth reached over and touched his hand. Just once, not for comfort, for connection. That night, she lay on her cot with her hand wrapped and her heart full of something she didn't yet know how to name. Elias moved about quietly, tending to the fire, locking the door, pausing once to glance at her with eyes that held something deeper than gratitude. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something older, sturdier. Trust made real, protection given freely, and beneath it all, the beginning of a bond that neither of them had expected but both of them had needed. Long after the house had gone quiet, Ruth lay awake and replayed the moment Elias struck the man without pause. The way his hands trembled just slightly when wrapping her wrist. She had been defended before in words, but never like this. Never with such immediacy, never with such care after. She didn't feel ashamed of the bruise. She felt seen. And in the stillness of that night, with the fire crackling low, she realized something had changed not just in Elias, but in her. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to belong. The accident happened just past noon, on a day too warm for October. The leaves had started to turn, their edges curling gold and rust, and the scent of pine hung heavy in the breeze. Ruth had sent the children out with buckets to gather kindling, reminding them not to wander near the eastern ridge where the ground sloped unevenly. She stayed behind to finish laundry, her hands red from cold water and scrubbing. It was quiet, peaceful in that way that made her feel settled. Then came the scream. It tore through the trees like a blade. Ruth dropped the sheet in her hands and ran, heart slamming against her ribs. She knew that scream. It was Samuel. She found them near the ridge, Miriam holding her brother's hand, tears streaking both their faces. Caleb stood nearby, pale and stunned. Samuel lay curled on the dirt, one leg twisted unnaturally beneath him, blood streaking from a gash on his forehead. He was crying, but not loudly anymore, just soft, gasping sobs that cut deeper than any scream. Ruth dropped to her knees beside him, brushing his hair from his eyes. "It's all right," she said gently, though her voice shook. "I've got you. I've got you now." She sent Caleb running for Elias and kept Miriam close to calm Samuel. Using her shawl, she wrapped his leg to keep it still and pressed her hand against his forehead to slow the bleeding. He clung to her arm, his fingers digging into her sleeve, and she whispered to him over and over, words she barely heard herself, words only meant to anchor him. Elias arrived minutes later, breathless, eyes wild. He scooped Samuel into his arms without hesitation, and together they carried him home, Ruth never leaving his side. Once back at the cabin, Elias laid the boy on the bed while Ruth cleaned the wound with water and vinegar. He winced and whimpered, but she never flinched. Elias held his hand and Ruth worked quietly, firmly, her hands steady even as her stomach turned. The wound wasn't deep, but the leg was likely sprained. She wrapped it tightly, then placed a cool cloth on Samuel's head. The others stood silently, watching. Liza began to cry, and Ruth pulled her close without thinking. The little girl melted into her arms, sobbing into Ruth's shoulder as if there was no one else she trusted to hold her grief. That night, the children refused to sleep unless Ruth stayed nearby. She sat between the cots, her back pressed to the wall, humming a song her mother had once sung when she was small. Her eyes stayed on Samuel, who now slept fitfully, and her hand rested on the blanket near his side, just in case he stirred. Elias came to check on them once, then left without a word, the door closing softly behind him. At some point in the early hours, Samuel stirred and mumbled through his fevered dreams. "Mama," he whispered, not reaching for anyone in particular, just speaking into the dark. The word hit Ruth like a wave. No one corrected him. Not Miriam, not Caleb, not even Liza, who had always been most fiercely protective of that title. The next day, when Ruth handed Liza her shoes and tied the laces, the little girl looked up and said it again. "Thank you, Mama," as naturally as if she'd always called her that. Caleb used it later that week when asking for help with his lesson slate. Miriam whispered it before bed, unsure but hopeful. And Ruth, each time, felt the name settle deeper into her bones. She didn't ask Elias about it. He didn't bring it up, but the way he looked at her changed. Not with surprise, but with quiet agreement, as if the children had simply said what he'd been too careful to speak aloud. He began including her in decisions about fencing, about winter supplies, about discipline and praise. She found herself planning meals with the pantry in mind, not just for the week, but for the future, thinking in terms of seasons, of years. One morning, as she packed Samuel's satchel for the trip to the schoolhouse, he looked at her and said, "Don't forget my apple, Mama." The word didn't make her flinch anymore. It made her smile, not wide but real, a small, quiet smile that belonged only to them. There was no certificate, no legal binding, no ceremony, just a dozen small moments layered over days and nights, till one day she realized she was no longer waiting to be accepted. She already had been. Not because she'd earned it, not because of obligation, but because love had found room in that small cabin and grown roots. Elias never spoke in grand gestures, but one evening, while sitting beside her on the porch as the sky burned orange behind the trees, he said, "They've never called anyone else that since their mother passed." Ruth turned to him, her eyes stinging. "I didn't take her place." "No," he said. "You didn't. You built your own." She looked out at the land they shared, at the place that had once felt foreign and now felt like the only home she'd ever truly known. She hadn't arrived as a mother or even as a wife, but somewhere between the scrapes and the soup pots, between the tears and the tenderness, she had become something she never thought she'd be again needed, loved, and without question. Theirs. The morning air was still, the kind of stillness that came only after a long stretch of shared silence. Ruth stood by the fence, one hand resting on the worn post, eyes fixed on the distant hills where the sun was beginning to burn off the last of the mist. The ground was damp with memory. For days, she'd been carrying a question inside her that she hadn't dared ask aloud. Elias had been quieter than usual. Not out of coldness, but something heavier, something she couldn't name. He moved through the cabin with a certain gentleness, as if every gesture held weight. She'd been preparing herself slowly, deliberately for the conversation she feared was coming. The chores had been done with more care than needed, the children's lunches packed with the kind of attention that made them pause and look at her funny. She'd even mended Elias's coat without being asked, her fingers moving over each stitch like a prayer she wasn't sure would be answered. When he finally spoke, it was not with drama or tension, just a quiet voice behind her, steady and solemn. "I thought I was giving you a way out." She didn't turn right away. She needed a moment to let the words settle. They weren't cruel, but they cut all the same. Slowly, she faced him. He stood a few paces back, hands in his pockets, eyes cast downward like a man afraid to look too directly at hope. "I thought," he continued, "maybe you stayed because it was safe, because you didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't want that to be the reason." She stepped toward him, her voice calm but certain. "You gave me a place to land, Elias, but I stayed because I chose to, not because I had to." He finally looked up, and she saw the storm of worry he'd been holding back. It had never been about pride for him. It was fear that he was just another place someone might settle until something better came along. Ruth shook her head, her voice firmer now. "Being chosen once feels like luck. Being chosen again, after someone has seen every part of you, the broken, the worn, the parts you try to hide, that's love." He stood very still. Then, slowly, as if afraid the moment might break, he took a step closer. "I've wanted to say that," he said, "but I wasn't sure I had the right." She closed the distance between them without hesitation. "We've both earned it," she said, "not in words. In everything else." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Ruth felt it brush against her cheek, but her focus was entirely on him. When he reached for her hand, he did so carefully, not as a man claiming something, but as someone asking to be held. They stood like that for a while, in the quiet morning, the land stretching out behind them, the cabin they had slowly built into a home just beyond the trees. It hadn't been easy. Nothing about their story had been smooth or quick, but it was real. The children came out one by one, half asleep and rubbing their eyes. Samuel stopped short when he saw them holding hands. Miriam grinned, nudging Caleb in the ribs. Liza ran forward and threw her arms around Ruth's waist without saying a word. Elias looked down at the girl, then at Ruth. They already knew, he said. Ruth smiled, her eyes warm. Children always know. Later that afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of the fence that had started to lean, Elias glanced at her, wiping sweat from his brow. "I used to think I was just getting by," he said, "feeding them, keeping the roof patched, making it to the next season." "And now," she asked, tying a length of twine, "now it feels like building," he said, "like there's something growing here, not just surviving." She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. The look they shared said everything in the quiet of that moment. Surrounded by trees and the sound of children laughing from the creek, Ruth understood that belonging wasn't something handed to her. It was something earned, step by step, through work, patience, and the soft persistence of love that never demanded but always showed up. That night, after the children were tucked in and the fire had settled low, Elias reached for her hand again, not like a man reaching for comfort or company, but like someone reaching for the rest of his life. She laced her fingers through his, and together they sat in the glow of a home they had both made possible. There was no declaration, no ring, no ceremony, but in the quiet, they had chosen each other not as rescuer and rescued, not as owner and dependent, but as equals. Two people who had weathered storms, carried bruises, and still stood, ready to face whatever came next with hands held, hearts open, and the kind of love that grows slow but sure. The summer came dry and mean, the kind of season that cracks earth and curls leaves before they even have the chance to turn. The creek behind the cabin slowed to a trickle, and the sky, wide and stubborn, offered no mercy. Dust gathered on windowsills, in the corners of eyes, in the throats of children who coughed through the night. The grass near the barn turned yellow, brittle underfoot, and even the animals grew quiet, as if trying not to draw attention from the heat. Ruth rose each morning before the sun crested the ridge, stepping barefoot onto the porch with a bucket in one hand and a prayer in the other. The garden lay still, its once rich soil hardened and gray. She knelt anyway, her knees pressing into the parched ground, her hands digging where no one else would have bothered. The corn had withered weeks ago. The beans hung limp on browning vines, even the tomatoes, her last holdout of hope, had begun to sag. But she didn't give up. She poured what little water they could spare into the roots, used dishwater when she had to, gathered runoff from the basin, stretched it further than it ought to go. Her fingers became calloused, her nails rimmed with earth, her skin browned and blistered. She didn't speak much during those weeks. She saved her voice for the plants, whispering to them as she worked, telling them stories she remembered from her childhood, songs her mother once hummed while hanging laundry. Her voice was cracked and soft, but she spoke as if they could hear her. Elias watched her from a distance. At first, he'd offered to help, but she had only smiled and said, "They know my hands." He didn't ask again. Instead, he built her a trellis from old fence posts and brought her cooled water from the spring house when the days burned hottest. He didn't speak of the drought. He didn't speak of what might happen if the rains didn't come. He simply let her believe, and in doing so, began to believe himself. The children tried to help. In their own way, Miriam brought old eggshells to crush into the soil. Samuel offered his school slate to shield the sprouts from direct sun. Lisa sat beside Ruth and sang nonsense lullabies to the roots. Caleb fetched water when the barrels ran low, not complaining even once when the buckets cut into his hands. Weeks passed like that, dry, brittle, endless. But the garden, somehow, didn't die. The beans came back first, small green shoots curling up the trellis like timid hands reaching for reassurance. Then the squash, stubborn, thick-bodied things that seemed to thrive in defiance. The tomatoes, once slumped and hopeless, began to fatten again, their skins shining faintly under layers of dust. And one morning Ruth stepped outside to find a bloom, just one on the edge of the corn row. She knelt before it, touched the fragile petals with reverence, and wept without sound. Elias found her there a short while later, still kneeling, her hands caked with soil, her face streaked with sweat and quiet tears. He didn't speak at first. He crouched beside her, looking not at the garden but at her, at the strength in her shoulders, the steadiness in her eyes, the deep, wordless faith she carried like a flame that refused to go out. He reached for her hands, took them gently in his. They were dry and cracked, worn from weeks of labor, but they didn't tremble. He turned them over in his palms, brushing a thumb across each knuckle. "You did this," he said, voice low and sure. "Not the rain, not the sun. You." Ruth looked at him, the weight of exhaustion giving way to something softer. "It's not just vegetables," she whispered. "It's proof we don't give up when it gets hard, not if something's worth tending." Elias brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, not hurried or embarrassed, but slow and full, as if the gesture alone might speak everything he couldn't say out loud. She let him, not because she needed it, but because she understood that even strength deserved tenderness. That evening, the garden glowed in the golden light of a reluctant sunset. The children danced between the rows, proud of each bloom, each fruit, as if the world had been rewritten just for them. Ruth stood on the porch, apron damp, hair coming loose from its braid, and looked out over what they had saved. It wasn't abundance, not yet, but it was life. It was hope, dug from dust and raised with hands that had once believed themselves incapable of making anything grow. Inside the cabin, the table had been set with roasted squash, warm bread, and fresh tomatoes sliced thin. Elias poured her coffee and sat close, his arm resting on the back of her chair without thinking. The children chattered, the fire crackled, and outside, the sky finally shifted heavy with the promise of long-awaited rain. But even before the first drop fell, Ruth knew they'd already weathered the hardest part. Not because the land had relented, but because she hadn't. Because when everything else dried up and faded, she stayed. She tended, she loved, and in doing so, she had become the soul of the home-rooted, resilient, and utterly unshakable. The offer came in a sealed envelope, thick paper with a gold-embossed seal that didn't belong in a place like theirs. Elias opened it at the kitchen table while Ruth kneaded bread beside him. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow and flour dusting her forearms like snowfall. He didn't speak at first, just read the letter twice over, lips pressed into a tight line. She could feel the shift in the room before he even looked up. He slid the letter across the table without a word. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over to read. The words were plain enough. A government representative, under the authority of the Railway Commission, was offering to purchase the land, not just the pasture behind the barn or the strip by the creek, all of it. Every acre Elias had cleared with his own hands. Every patch Ruth had coaxed back to life. The cabin, the garden, the orchard, the place where the children had carved their initials into the oldest pine tree. All of it wanted for track and timber and transit. They think money's enough, Elias finally said, as if they can buy roots out of the ground. Ruth didn't answer. She walked to the window and looked out at the land. It wasn't perfect. Some seasons were harder than others. The roof still leaked in the corner by the loft. The far fence needed mending. But every inch of it held their story, hard-earned, slow-grown, sacred. This wasn't just land. It was where she became herself again. Later that week, a man in a gray coat arrived. He stepped from a polished wagon with a smile too wide for his face and boots too clean for the dirt road. He shook Elias's hand and made a show of looking impressed. He spoke of progress and national interest, said the railway would bring opportunities. He even mentioned compensation figures as if the worth of a home could be tallied in coin. Elias stood silent while the man talked. He let him walk the edge of the garden, tip his hat to Ruth, who watched from the porch with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. When the man had said everything he'd come to say, Elias only replied with 7 words. "This land is not for sale, ever." The man blinked, confused. "But Mr. Hart, you heard me," Elias said, voice like stone. The man left with his papers still in his satchel and dust on his polished boots. The next morning, Ruth found Elias hammering a post into the front of the property, right where the road split near the edge of the pasture. He'd carved the sign himself. The letters were rough but strong. Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough. She stood beside him as he worked, watching the way his shoulders moved, the quiet way he set things into place. When he finished, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at the words. "It's not just about the railroad," he said. "It's about remembering why we started." She nodded. "This land gave us a second chance." He turned to her, eyes steady. "It gave us a life." As word spread, neighbors stopped by to ask if the rumors were true. Some shook their heads, calling it foolish to pass up such an offer. Others smiled quietly, understanding something deeper. And every time someone asked, Ruth would point to the sign. That was all the answer they ever needed. Seasons turned, as they always did. The children grew. Caleb took over more of the lumbering. Samuel learned to repair tools with his father. Miriam began keeping ledgers, and Liza, ever the bold one, talked about becoming a teacher. They carried the rhythm of the land in their bones, shaped by the steadiness of the soil and the people who had raised them with care. One autumn afternoon, Ruth walked the edge of the garden with Liza, who was home from her studies. The girl paused beside the sign and ran her fingers over the carved letters. "Do you remember when you first came here?" Liza asked. "I remember thinking I wouldn't stay," Ruth said, smiling gently. But I was wrong. Staying was the best thing I ever did. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky caught fire with gold and rose, Elias took Ruth's hand as they sat on the porch. The air smelled of pine and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a train's whistle echoed, faint and far off, but it did not come near. The tracks had been laid elsewhere, through fields that held no such sign, no such promise. Elias squeezed her hand. When they ask why I said no, he murmured, I think about that day I first saw you in the market, holding your own sorrow like armor, and how all I wanted was to make sure you never had to leave again. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You didn't just let me stay, she whispered. You built something with me. The stars came out, one by one. And the land, though quiet, held every story they'd ever lived, not for sale, not for trade, not for anything but memory, love, and the legacy they had grown, season after season, hand in hand. The morning started like any other, with the sound of roosters and the gentle creak of floorboards as the children stirred. Ruth moved through the cabin with practiced ease, packing lunches, tying hair ribbons, and reminding Caleb to wear his good shoes since the school inspector was visiting. It was a day like any other, till Liza returned home that afternoon, clutching a folded piece of paper tight in her hand, her cheeks flushed with excitement and something deeper Ruth couldn't yet name. She handed Ruth the paper without a word and stood back, eyes bright but guarded. Ruth unfolded it slowly and found a school registration form, the kind they filled out every year. And there in the space labeled parent or guardian was written, in careful child handwriting, the name Liza Ruth Hart. Ruth read it twice, her fingers trembling slightly. The ink wasn't smudged. The letters were deliberate. There was no mistake. I told them that's who I am, Liza said quietly. That's who you are to me. Ruth didn't speak at first. Her heart had swollen too quickly in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked down at the form again, then at Liza, whose chin was lifted in that stubborn, earnest way that had always reminded her of Elias. The child didn't smile, didn't wait for approval. She had simply told the truth, and now waited to see if it was allowed. Ruth pulled her close, wrapping her in arms that had once been unsure of their right to hold. But not anymore, not after the years of scraped knees, whispered lullabies, hard winters, and warm hands. That's exactly right, she said, voice thick with emotion. That's exactly who we are. Later that evening, after supper and dishes and bedtime stories, Elias brought out a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He placed it gently in Ruth's lap and sat beside her, waiting. She looked at him, puzzled, then untied the string. Inside was a notebook, simple, with a sturdy cover and blank pages that smelled faintly of ink and pine glue. Her fingers brushed over the surface as if it were made of glass. I thought maybe, Elias said, his voice low, you might want to start writing things down. For yourself, for them, for the things we don't always get to say out loud. Ruth didn't speak. She opened to the first page, the paper clean and waiting. For a long moment, she stared at it, not knowing where to begin. Then slowly, with the same hands that had tilled soil and held fevered foreheads and cradled frightened hearts, she picked up the pencil. Her handwriting was plain, but every word settled like stone on the page. Today is the first day I was loved without having to give birth to anyone. She stared at the sentence for a long time, feeling the truth of it echo through her chest. There had been a time when her worth was measured by what she could produce, by what her body could offer others, a time when she was passed from hand to hand like a broken promise. But not here, not with Elias, not with the children who now carried pieces of her in the way they spoke, the way they trusted, the way they came to her first in joy and in need. She closed the notebook gently, like sealing something sacred. Elias reached over and took her hand. They didn't speak about what she had written. They didn't need to. He had always understood her in silence better than most people did in speech. The next day, Ruth found the notebook on the windowsill where the morning sun hit just right. She opened it and saw that Liza had added a drawing on the second page, a little cabin, 4 figures outside, and a garden that stretched in every direction. Above it, the child had written in block letters, "Home." That evening, when Ruth tucked her in, Liza asked, "Will you still be my mama when I'm big?" Ruth smiled, brushing hair from the girl's forehead. "I'll be yours for as long as you want me." Even as the children grew and the seasons shifted, the names they shared weren't traced by bloodlines or documents. They were etched into chores done side by side, stories told by firelight, letters sounded out at the kitchen table, and hands held through heartache. They were spoken in the quiet way Elias said our Ruth when introducing her to a neighbor, and in the confident way the children claimed her in every crowded room. Years later, when Caleb was asked on a scholarship form to list his mother's maiden name, he paused, then wrote, "Unknown." But she answers to Ruth. In time, the world forgot about the offer from the railway, about the woman once sold like property, about the names she'd once been called. But the people she raised never forgot who she became. And when new hands came to till the land, they found that notebook in a drawer, still clean on most pages except for one sentence, written long ago by a woman who finally understood her worth. "Today is the first day I was loved without having to give birth to anyone." The years passed slowly and then all at once, marked by seasons of planting and harvest, by the sound of children growing into their own voices, by the steady rhythm of lives built through care more than grand declarations. Ruth and Elias grew older side by side, their love not loud but woven deep into the grain of the wood that framed their home, into the lines etched on their hands, into the worn path between the porch and the garden. It was a quiet love, enduring and unshakable, shaped not by passion but by presence. When Elias's hair turned white and his steps grew slower, Ruth still rose before him to make coffee and sweep the porch. When her eyes began to fail her in the candlelight, he read aloud from the newspaper, even if she had already heard the story. They aged gently, never in fear of being left behind, because they had long ago promised without ceremony that they would carry one another to the end. Their children returned often, now grown with lives of their own. Liza came back from her school in town to visit every Sunday, bringing her own daughter, who always ran straight to Ruth's lap. Caleb took over the lumbering, working the same land his father once tamed. But he still called Elias for advice before felling any tree near the creek. Miriam planted a new herb bed near the garden, and Samuel built a bench beneath the old apple tree, the one Ruth had saved during the worst drought they'd ever seen. It was under that tree, one spring morning, that Elias passed. He had been sitting quietly with a blanket across his knees, his hands folded over one another, the sunlight painting his face in soft gold. Ruth found him just after sunrise, still and at peace. She sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." She outlived him by 2 years. Those final seasons filled with reflection more than sorrow. She tended the garden with the same hands that had once coaxed life from dry soil. The children came often, never letting her feel alone. When her time came, it was gentle. She passed in her sleep, a small smile on her face, a notebook resting on her chest, the same one Elias had given her years before. They buried her next to him, just as she had asked, beneath the same apple tree, its branches now thick with fruit and memory. The garden stretched wide around them, filled with flowers she'd planted in the later years, sunflowers that turned to follow the light, lavender that calmed the children when they were restless, and rows of tomatoes, beans, and squash still bearing more than enough for the table. On her gravestone, beneath her name carved with care, were words chosen not by her but by those who had known her best. Here grew everything she was never given and all that she gave anyway. People came to visit, not in great numbers, but often enough. Neighbors, friends, travelers who'd heard about the garden that never gave up. They brought seeds and stories, left little bundles of herbs or pages from journals. Some came to sit in silence, others to speak aloud to the wind, as if Ruth might still be listening. The house remained lived in, loved. Lisa moved into it with her own family for a time, keeping the rooms full of warmth. The porch creaked the same way. The kitchen smelled of coffee in the morning and stew in the evening. The fire still crackled in winter. The garden never stopped blooming. The children made sure of that. So did their children. Every spring, someone would kneel in the dirt Ruth once worked with such devotion, and every fall, someone would gather the fruits of her care. The apple tree grew taller, its shade stretching wider with each passing year. Beneath it, the earth held not just their bodies but their story. They had begun as two people marked by sorrow, scarred by abandonment and failure. But here, they had grown something else. Together, they had built a life out of scraps, raised a family not by blood but by choice, and planted love in a place where it had once seemed impossible. No one who visited that patch of land ever left unchanged. The sign still stood by the road, weathered now but legible. Not for sale. Someone was once allowed to stay here. That is enough. And above the sign, high on a wooden post, someone had carved another line, added decades later. And because they stayed, everything else was able to grow. In the quiet rustle of leaves, in the soft buzz of bees weaving through blossoms, in the laughter of children pulling carrots from the soil, their love endured, not just in memory, but in motion, in every act of care, in every second chance given freely, in every seed planted with faith that something beautiful could still take root. As we journey through life, many of us come to understand that family isn't always built by blood, it's built by love, loyalty, and shared burdens. This story reminds us that it's never too late to find belonging or to become someone's safe place. Ruth was once discarded for what she couldn't give, yet she became the heart of a home by simply showing up each day with care and perseverance. For older adults who have weathered loss, change, or loneliness, her story offers hope that dignity can be restored, love can be chosen again, and the most meaningful legacies come not from grand gestures but from quiet consistency. Whether it's tending a garden, mending a child's hurt, or simply being present for someone who needs us. Our worth doesn't fade with age, it deepens. We all carry the power to grow something lasting, even from broken ground. And sometimes being allowed to stay really stay is the greatest gift of all.